Jordan Estrada of Let's Talk to Them on how he wants to apply mass shooting prevention techniques to stop assassinations. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week, we are discussing, we've talked about some pretty horrible violence the last couple of episodes here. And this week, we're going to be doing that again, but focused a little more on potential solutions. And to do that, we actually have Jordan Estrada, who is the director of Let's Talk to Them, one of the nonprofits we've had on the show before to kind of discuss solutions to mass shootings. And now, he's working on potential solutions to this assassination issue that we've started to see come up here with United Healthcare and then Charlie Kirk just recently. So welcome back to the show, Jordan. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me. Great to be on again.
Yeah, absolutely. And just can you give people a little bit of background of what exactly is Let's Talk to Them and what the concept is and how you guys operate?
Yeah, so Let's Talk to Them as a nonprofit. We were founded in 2022, got our 501c3 tax exempt status last year. And as our name implies, our goal is to prevent mass shootings by reaching out to and talking to and hopefully providing redemptive care for individuals who are having thoughts or perhaps ideation or even potential perpetrators of mass violence. And to do that, there's a couple different methods that we employ, but our two main methods is first, we do direct outreach online to internet subcultures. We identify the cultures where people are talking, joking, and potentially planning acts of mass violence, and we run a campaign to redirect those people from those communities to our care websites, and from then options for counseling, options to connect with people, get help, and hopefully put them on a path of recovery. We do that on social media, so we kind of meet people in the doom scroll brain rot within these niche subcultures, and we've had a very successful rate of getting people to actually leave that doom scroll. Which makes me very happy, because when you're on that doom scroll, you typically stay on the doom scroll. You're just going to keep scrolling, looking for more content. But we're actually able to reach people there and get them to leave that in these problematic internet areas and come to our care websites where they have the option to get help from there. And then in addition to that, we also we provide consultation and coaching to churches, schools, youth organizations, and other people who potentially have contact with potential perpetrators. We provide coaching to them for how to identify individuals who might be thinking or having, temptations to think about this type of violence. We coach them about what to do if they have those individuals and how to get them to care. And we've been able to assist 12 organizations in dealing with a specific threat where they had a concern about an individual in their organization.
Yeah. And, you're obviously a relatively new group, but you're one of the only ones I've seen that has taken some of the research that I think is most insightful on the problem of mass violence in the United States, mass shootings and other forms of mass violence, which is called the Violence Project, which we've had Professor James Densley, who was one of the researchers in that, on the show before. And I just think that their research, where they essentially went out and interviewed a bunch of victims and survivors and perpetrators of mass violence to try and get a better understanding of what this particular mental health spiral is actually like in practice, and how you can identify signs for it and then use different techniques to off-ramp people, which is essentially what you guys are doing. You're one of the only ones I've seen try to adapt real-world techniques based off this research, beyond just, obviously, part of that would just be better mental health care generally and more available mental health care. But you guys have really zeroed in on the mass violence aspect of that, and I think taken the lessons from that research and tried to apply them in real world, right? I mean, that's essentially the idea, right?
That's exactly right. So when we started, before we even began to run our outreach campaigns, we distilled and consumed all the existing research, all the existing body of knowledge on understanding what makes people contemplate acts of mass violence, and how can we dissuade them and redirect them onto a better path. And foremost in what we studied was the offerings from the Violence Project. Big shout out to them. Very thankful for all the work they've done, and we do rely heavily on their research to guide our work.
Because the idea here is somebody who's potentially going to commit an act of mass violence is in, as I alluded to earlier, a mental health spiral, and there are signs of this. There's leakage, is what they call it in the Violence Project, where somebody will go online, perhaps, or in their in real world situations, and they will talk about wanting to do this. And so that's those moments, if you can identify them, where you can do what's called off-ramping. It's a similar concept around how to deal with somebody who's going through suicidal ideation. And but you guys are trying to build those off-ramps for people, right? In real life, through online interactions, but in practice, you're trying to go out and actually figure out techniques to get people out of, as you said, the doom scrolling cycle, to get them away from the sort of content that is going to encourage that spiral that they're in, and off to, what did you call it earlier? You had a term for it.
So we get them from the doom scroll to our care websites, and then on our care websites, they have options to read inspirational literature that's specifically geared towards them. It's like talking to them. It's like, hey, we know you're thinking about these sorts of things. Here's other things you could think about, or here's how to process these deep feelings. And if you want to talk to someone, we partner with crisis hotlines, crisis care groups that give them an option to talk to a live person, connect with them, and then hopefully get the help and recovery they need.
Well, I think you call it like redemptive care.
But yes, redemptive care is something that I'm very passionate about, because we say we want to save the lives of victims by saving the life of the perpetrator, and that's a little controversial because some people are like, oh, these perpetrators are pure evil. We just have to stop them before they commit that horrific act. That's when we have to save them. That's when we have to save their life and redirect them onto a life-saving path. It's very similar to Aaron Stark. We also relied heavily on Aaron Stark and his story. He was famous for his TED talk about how when he was a teen, he almost became a mass shooter. And we worked closely with Aaron. He helped guide a lot of our understanding of how we would run our outreach programs. And we're essentially trying to replicate his experience in the lives of people who are going through exactly what he was going when he was in that situation.
Yeah, and that is, I guess, what would be the controversial aspect of both the Violence Project research and what you guys are doing, is this idea that these people aren't inherently going to carry out these attacks. There are ways that you can prevent it. They're not just born evil or whatever. And oftentimes, if you read the Violence Project's research, obviously this is an outgrowth of childhood trauma of one form or another, severe childhood trauma. But the hope in that research is that this is not inevitable. And that is, again, and you're right, like that's not, I think, what most people would think about mass shooters or how they would look at them, potential perpetrators, school shooters. That's not how, or as we're going to talk about here in a moment, assassins. That's not how a lot of people would view those people. They would just view them as irredeemable, and you have to stop them through force rather than but that's not what the Violence Project found in their research, and it's not what you guys are seeing in practice when you're trying to implement those lessons, right?
Yeah, and that's not to reduce, these acts are pure evil. I think it's an extreme manifestation of evil when people do this. But, as Americans, we believe innocent until proven guilty. So before, in that space, in that moment before somebody actually does something, that's the perfect time to try to encourage them to stay on that path of innocence, to not take the plunge into these acts of horrific evil. And that's really where we try to meet people. We meet people at the very early stages. We meet people when they're liking, memes about mass violence or 9/11 or dead babies. We meet people in that very early stage when there's still a lot of hope for them to be redeemed from that path and go on to live a successful and very happy life.
And can you give us, obviously we talked about this when you were first on the show, but can you give us an update on some of the numbers you're seeing, like what kind of effect you're having with these techniques?
Yeah, so we haven't obviously published our 2025 report yet, but we're currently, our current campaign, we're always iterating campaigns, our current based on what we've learned in the previous one. So our current one, we started it in August 1st. So it's been running since August 1st, and the last numbers that I was looking at, we've gotten a ton of exposure on social media, but we're specifically trying to get people to read this blog post that we wrote because it's something that that we think will resonate very highly with people who are in this space. So we've gotten approximately 3,000 people to kind of get off the doom scroll and instead go to our website and read this blog post that we think is very timely and useful for people who might be struggling with this sort of thing. So that to me, like that's a big success definition for me, just being able to get people to leave and then come to some place where instead of getting that brain rot, they're getting something that's actually edifying, that's actually built on psychological best practices for intervention. And then from there, we've gotten about 7 people to actually go ahead and choose to click through to counseling resources. So a small number, but again, when we talk about mass shooters, we're looking at a very niche metric. So we're not looking for our content to we never want our content to go viral. We are looking at a very small subset of the population. So when I see numbers like 3,000 or 7, that makes me very happy because those are the amounts of people that potentially could prevent one of these acts from happening.
Right. And I think so last year, just looking at your website here, the 2024 results, you had 114 at-risk individuals click through to a counseling resource.
Yeah, we've already blown way past that in this total year. I don't have the exact numbers, but I think we're close to 200. So every time we run one of these campaigns, it gets more successful. We reach more people, and we have more of these types of interactions where people will either seek help, or in some cases, and this is not, we're not running an op. Like I'm very clear on this. Like we're not trying to find people. We're trying to get them to find us. So we're not doing surveillance. We're not trying to like catch people or get people in a trap online. It's more like we go to the bad places of the internet and we put up a billboard in those, dark communities, and we attract people to that light. Every now and then, in the process of doing that, some people will leak sometimes someone will leak plans to us. And this year we had one incident where somebody contacted us and told us they were planning to do an act of violence, and we were able to take that forward to the appropriate authorities. And once you hand it off to the authorities, there's not that great communication back and forth, especially with non-government nonprofits. But to the best of our knowledge, that's been safely mitigated, and that attack did not go through. So
you do have real world examples of what you're doing actually working. Mm-hmm. So I guess that brings us to the main topic I want to talk about here, which is now you, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination and a few other really political assassinations we've seen this year, the Minnesota former Speaker of the House, the United Healthcare CEO's murder, you are perceiving that this could be, another form of the similar phenomenon that we're seeing, this negative event, like these political assassinations or high profile killings that we've seen, may be related in some ways to mass shootings or school shootings that we've seen that have been much more common in our recent era, right, in our generation, or the last few decades, compared to assassinations were a major issue in, say, like the 1960s through the 1970s, but they've become mass shootings have really become a greater issue since then. But you think that perhaps there's you're seeing a connection, and you want to try and do some research into this new era of assassinations that we're now unfortunately dealing with, and perhaps develop a similar approach in trying to prevent them as well.
Yeah. I think something we see is that, and something everyone acknowledges, that oftentimes the motivation for committing an act of mass violence is that the instant notoriety, the instant infamy. A person can go from being unknown to all of a sudden their face and their name is everywhere. And there's been a lot of efforts, try to address the media reporting to reduce this. But the fact of the matter is that it is true. Like, the people who perpetrate these crimes do achieve a level of notoriety. As mass shootings become more common, or as people become more used to them, it's almost difficult, to say this, but there's almost like a exhaustion in the public mind when it comes to mass violence. A lot of people, they won't even click on the news stories, they won't even read about it because they're just tired and depressed of hearing about this. Media outlets, they report about another mass shooting is a common phrase. So there's almost this national fatigue on the issue. So if you are a disturbed individual, if you are in a mental health crisis and you're looking to achieve instant notoriety, to broadcast your dissatisfaction with the world, it does seem like an event such as the Charlie Kirk assassination, such as a public assassination, would be a way for somebody to contemplate doing something that would both send their strong dissatisfaction and also express that grievance in a way that would shock and appall the nation. Because the goal for a lot of these perpetrators is to shock, is to terrorize, is to get that visceral reaction from so many people. And there's no reason why the people would not push the envelope, to do things that are even more shocking, even more appalling. So knowing what we've learned about mass shootings, Columbine was kind of the turning point for a lot of what we see today, and that it's consistently been copied, it's consistently been studied by perpetrators. And looking at the time, we didn't know that was going to happen. We did not know at the time that Columbine was going to become almost the playbook for these perpetrators.
Yeah, I mean, Columbine wasn't even the first school shooting that year. But it was the one that happened to be carried out in a way and at a moment, especially like media moment, not necessarily news media, though that was the 24-hour cable news was brand new at the time, but a media environment that it really was suited for, maybe not even intentionally on the part of the attackers, but it had happened to capture that the moment so well that it became this template, right? I mean, that's the idea, or that's what's in that's how the Violence Project talks about it, right? Exactly.
So we, and you and I have talked about this, we kind of see the current string of political violence as potentially, and you never know the future, but you learn from history and try to anticipate things, especially in our role, of trying to like head off these violent subcultures, like try to stay ahead of them, try to always be one step ahead. It's not. It definitely seems like these acts of assassination could serve as a template or as an inspiration for future copycats to go and do the same thing. And I'm sure you've read Malcolm Gladwell's essay, "The Thresholds of Violence." It talks about how mass shootings is, the more it spreads, the more people will consider it. So basically, you might have a person, he basically applies riot theory. And riot theory is that everybody has a number. If enough people ahead of you are rioting, you'll join into the riot. And then he applies that to mass violence. And you could easily see how this could apply to there's a lot of people that would never consider this, but if it becomes commonplace, if more and more people are doing it, then more people begin to consider it. So that's one of
the big threats of political violence, certainly. Is that a fact?
Scary to think about. So we want to kind of get ahead of that and kind of expect the emergence of what I would call assassination culture, because we talk about mass shooting subcultures. There's probably going to be a emergence of some sort of an assassination culture. Some could argue it already exists, given the amount of people that have favorably commented and editorialized the recent assassination. So you could say you could say it already exists. But we need to figure out we need to understand the extent and magnitude of that, and we need to figure out the best strategies for off-ramping and redirecting those people to hope and recovery, just as we've worked with mass shooters to understand how to off-ramp them to hope and recovery. So it's a similar phenomenon. Like there's so many similarities, but a new approach is required because it's definitely its own thing. One specific instance that sets it apart one specific feature that sets it apart is that the assassins don't seem to immediately then end their lives. Like they do seem to have an intention to escape and to maybe get away with it. So that's very different than traditionally mass shooters go into it expecting to not survive, to the point that we view it as a form of suicide, suicide by mass shooting. So there's definitely a difference there that assassins seem to want to get away with it. And so we need to understand that. We need to understand the intersections with mass violence. We need to understand how the internet subcultures are contributing, the intersectionality between mass shooting subcultures and potentially assassination subcultures. And then we need to figure out the best strategies for, again, providing redemptive care to these people, reaching out to young people who might be tempted by that thought, and figuring out how to, discourage them from that, but redirect them onto a path of hope and recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. Right. And we'll get into some of the details of the mechanic, because it's not just, you see a potential overlap here. You guys also have a specific plan that you want to pursue, which we will definitely talk about. But first I wanted to just reiterate what you're saying here. It's double down on this point about the riot theory Malcolm Gladwell has discussed, but also, I mean, you can tell by preferred research on this is the Violence Project, but they note the same phenomenon. Yeah, the social proofing is what they call it, right? Where it's sort of this idea that if somebody, it's kind of it's almost like a trope, right? The school shooter is a trope in our society, right? We have
or an archetype,
right? We have an idea. Everybody knows what that person looks like or is like. And, the school shooters have that idea in their head too. And it's not so much that especially in the case of mass shooters or school shooters, that society says this is a good thing that you can do, but society says this is a thing that people like this do. And, and so the more that's reinforced, and that's where the whole Columbine playbook thing comes in as well. Yeah. It's not just, this is a thing that you could do if you're like this. This is how you do this thing. If you're like this, you leave a manifesto, you wear a certain band's shirt. We saw that in the immediate, there was a school shooting after the United Healthcare shooting that I discussed why I was so concerned about the United Healthcare shooting becoming a Columbine-like event, because immediately afterward, there was a shooting that emphasized the impact, the legacy of Columbine, where a 15-year-old shooter murdered several people at her school. And she had worn one of the shirts of the band that the Columbine shooters wore. At one point, she was clearly referencing them she left a manifesto. She carried out the attack in a similar way. And she was born 10 years after Columbine happened. And she's still referencing back as the playbook that, it's like a game of telephone at this point, where things get, Columbine didn't happen the way a lot of people assume, they weren't bullied. There's all these myths around Columbine that aren't necessarily true, but still get brought up in, especially in the mass shooter culture that's built around it. But, the point is, it still goes back to that point. And it's not, certainly the Columbine shooters seem to have wanted people to know what they were doing, why they were doing it, and hope to inspire others. But I think, it goes back to, and I would say that Luigi Mangione, the United Healthcare CEO assassin, also wanted to potentially inspire other people. But what concerns me more about it is the moment that it happened at, and how well it was suited for our current media environment, which is dominated by quick short form video. And his act of violence, his murder, was caught on security camera that was very quickly spread around the entire globe, and in a media environment where it's almost impossible to avoid it. Columbine, the internet made it easy for people to seek out and find the manifestos if they wanted to, in a way that wasn't necessarily possible before then. Now, TikTok and Instagram Reels have made it impossible to avoid these things at this point, especially the actual violence, the actual video of the killings. And that combined with the praise that it received, that his act received, makes it feel like this is a potential Columbine type moment. Now, we don't know that that's the case, right? This Kirk assassination shares a number of similar features, right? The messages on the ammunition, the extremely viral nature of the violence itself was impossible to avoid. On the internet, the short form clips of Kirk being murdered. But, you know, I don't want to just, this validates something I was talking about during the first killing. And so it's easy to argue that, oh, okay, this is clearly what's happening. I don't know that we know that yet, right? We do have some numbers. I think you had some numbers, but we don't know for sure. But there are reasons to think that could be, we could be seeing that effect playing out here too.
Yeah. And I think from a journalistic point of view, you know, you want to be careful not to draw a trend, but, you know, my background is in industrial security, and in the security industry, you're always trying to preempt and kind of stay ahead of emerging threats. So if we can keep it from becoming a trend, that would be awesome, right? If we could you know, if we could get ahead of this and make it so that it doesn't become the next trend, you know, if your theory doesn't become true, that would be great. I think that would save a lot of lives. So from my perspective, we're thinking of, you know, what if this is the new thing, and let's plan for that and hopefully prevent it from becoming the next new thing.
Yeah. So journalistic responsibility makes me want to question whether these really are trends happening. Whereas for your purposes, you're trying to identify trends before they spiral out of control, I guess, and trying to intercede and prevent them from becoming the next big thing, right? That's the idea here. And then there are good reasons to think perhaps this is a trend that we're seeing. Perhaps this is something that's feeding off of itself and could be the next major issue of in American violence. And we want to try to keep it from happening.
Right.
So to that end, you know, I mentioned earlier, you have specific ideas here. It's not just, we see some connections and we want to get involved. What are you trying to do? What's right now, what are you working on?
Yeah. So when we started our efforts to confront mass violence, we had a pretty straightforward playbook. The first step was to understand, you know, the extent of the issue, then learn the best practices, that, you know, the psychologically optimized strategies for reaching our specific audience, and then executing that in the form of campaigns on social media and through awareness and coaching and teaching organizations. So we're prepared to follow the same exact playbook, and it starts with understanding, you know, the extent and magnitude of what we're up against. There's a lot of overlap with suicide prevention, and in the suicide prevention industry, there's a ton of data that exists that kind of helps inform those efforts. Because again, it's not about how many people commit suicide, tragically. It's about how many people think about it, how many people had a plan, and then if you can reach those people who are thinking and planning about it, you can prevent that. You can hopefully help them and prevent them from going on to the stage of actually doing it. So we know, thanks to some good research, it's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They do an annual study every year where you know, there's like 30 questions on there about ideation, fantasies, like how often do you think about this? How often have you made a plan? Have you ever tried but failed? So all this extensive data about the ideation and mental planning that goes into potential suicide attempts. And so based on these studies, we know how many people commit suicide, but we also know how many people think about it, plan it, attempt it. We don't have that same sort of data about mass violence. We don't know how many people. We know how many people commit acts of mass violence, you know, depending on which of the sources you're using. But we don't know how many people think about it, how many people plan it, how many people, you know, if you do think about it, is it a passing fantasy that you think about once, or is it something you think about 3 or more times? There are all these questions that are asked on the suicide survey from SAM HSA, and we basically want to replicate that for understanding mass violence. So we're working together with researchers from University of South Carolina. We've put together a research proposal for understanding basically the same questions that we know about suicide, but pivoting those to look at mass violence as well. And we would like to go further. We would like to add, thoughts of political violence. How often do you ever think about, taking out somebody who you disagree with? All the questions that would help us understand the extent of assassination ideation or political violence ideation. And these surveys are non-invasive. Again, we're not trying to catch anyone or run an op on anyone. It's all voluntarily participated. Survey applicants know that they're in these studies. It falls under best practices for medical and mental health research. So we're kind of spearheading an effort to launch these types of surveys. We're trying to lobby for organizations such as SAM HSA to include these types of questions in their surveys, and we're trying to kick off a survey of our own. Longitudinal multidisciplinary survey that would help fill in these gaps and help us understand how many people are actually thinking about this. And once that's accomplished, once you know the extent of the ideation, then you know how you have to tailor your approach. If it's something that a large percent of the population thinks about, like we know from the SAM HSA study that a large percent of the population thinks about suicide. So based on that, we know that suicide prevention has to be broadly promulgated. We have to make sure everybody is on board. Teachers, parents, church youth leaders, peers. Everybody has the tools because we know it's broad. And so that really guides our approach of how we get the message out. And then building on that, and then kind of concurrently, while that's going on, it may take some time to get those studies done. But what we can do right now, what we've already starting to do right now, is understanding what type of things would resonate with the mindset of somebody who's thinking about doing this. So this is what we did with mass violence. You and I, like, there are things that would discourage us from acting. Like, you and I would be motivated not to hurt people out of empathy. We don't want to see people crying. We don't want to see people get hurt. Somebody who is contemplating an act of mass violence, oftentimes they lack that empathy. So telling them, oh, you don't want to hurt people, you don't want to see people are sad, that's not going to motivate them. We need to find the specific things that demotivate and de-escalate them. So when we look at assassinations, we have to understand what speaks to them, like what would make them not do it. And I think it's going to be a very unique set of things. Obviously we're just starting out on this, but one thing that comes to mind that I think would be very demotivating to a potential assassin is just this knowledge that if you assassinate someone, you basically put a megaphone on their message. You expand their message. And we've seen this with Charlie Kirk. After his death, his message has become so much bigger, so much stronger because of this act against him. So really, if it's the martyr syndrome. If somebody is martyred, their message becomes all that more powerful. A lot of political analysts have said that it was because that the attempted assassination on Trump actually helped him, win the election later on, because it gave him that sense that he was. Yeah, exactly. So that, off the top of my head, like, that's one thing that I think could be very helpful in discouraging people from seeking political violence or assassinations. But we want to understand.
You want to go and well, one, you want to figure out how common are these thoughts, both mass violence, but also political assassination. How often do people think about, because you or I, it might not be relatable to most people, right? The thought of committing mass violence or going and shooting a politician or a commentator. But, clearly some people have these thoughts, and some small percentage of the population, very small percentage of the population actually carries out these thoughts, acts on them. Whereas suicide is much more common, sadly. It's all terrible, but suicide is the most common form of gun death in the United States.
Right. Yeah.
It's tens of thousands of people a year, whereas mass shootings are, maybe if you either go with the active shooter, it's maybe a couple of dozen times a year. People who actually murder more than 4 people that's a handful, dozen at most years. But the idea is that, okay, that's how many people succeed at carrying out this terrible thing. Same for political assassinations. It's still, these are all things that they're very high profile, and they're high profile because they're shocking and they're horrible, but they are still relatively rare, and on a raw numbers basis, of course. But the idea here is figure out how many people are thinking about doing this, and then figure out what are the arguments or what are the things you can point out to these people who having these thoughts that can dissuade them. Right? That's basically what you want to accomplish.
Exactly. We need to understand we need to first understand everything about potential motivations, and then figure out the counters to those motivations. Like what would encourage, if this is what you're thinking of doing, what would encourage you, not to do it. And then, it opens the door to have a conversation, to maybe, talk to a crisis counselor, talk to somebody, like our name says, let's talk to, that's what we're all about, is like trying to talk to people. Because if we can communicate, then we can hopefully redirect them to hope and recovery.
Before they can, carry out these horrible acts. And, oftentimes, people who carry out attacks like this end up regretting them, of course, as well.
Yeah, I think so.
And so, you want to get them to that place of understanding why this would, even if the arguments that would work for the most people who don't have this type of ideation, just like not everyone has suicidal ideation, and the arguments for why you wouldn't want to take your own life are going to work differently on people who aren't considering that already than they are on people considering it. And same concept here, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
And so that makes a lot of sense. But you want to obviously, you want to do this scientifically. You're not just trying to, there are things, as you mentioned, like the idea of what a political assassin is very likely to have the opposite effect of what they're hoping, right, in the sense that oftentimes they are elevating the people that they're trying to silence. Regardless of the political bent of the assassin or the target, that's generally what tends to happen. And maybe, I guess, something that they're not, perhaps people in that state of mind are not fully considering. But, it does strike me, obviously, as two different problems, right? As you mentioned, there's some similarities, but some differences often, and we've seen this with all three of the examples that we gave, and including, I think, one of the Trump attempted assassins also tried to escape, and the one who actually took shots and hit Trump in the ear and killed one of the rally goers was immediately killed by the Secret Service. We don't know what he
we don't know what he was going to do after.
But the rest of them have all tried to escape. Certainly Mangione took 5 days to capture him. Kirk's shooter got hundreds of miles away and doesn't seem apparently turned himself in. Eventually was convinced to turn himself in. Although he was, reports were that he was suicidal at that point. So I don't know. But it does. Yeah, the point is there's some differences we can see off the bat. Also, they tend to just target a single person, although sometimes, obviously in the Trump assassination attempt, there was collateral damage that took the life of somebody, there. So, but their violence is more targeted, it appears. The Kirk assassin took a single shot. I guess what do you expect the differences to be, and why do you think similar techniques will work with these sort of political assassins?
Yeah, so I think the difference is, like we've talked about, when we look at perpetrators of mass violence, we draw this triple Venn diagram, and it's anger, depression, and social isolation. And we find that and this is built, this is straight from the Violence Project. If somebody is angry, depressed, and socially isolated, there's a high probability that they will have thoughts, whether passingly, or dwellingly, whether it's just like a single thought or whether it's something they begin to start planning. If they're in that nexus of that Venn diagram of anger, depression, and social isolation, we would consider them at risk of having thoughts of mass violence. So it's a little bit different. Let's say you have somebody who is angry and socially isolated, but not depressed. So that person is also, they lack the social networks that are going to keep them from doing something extreme. So if somebody was angry, socially isolated, but not depressed, then that could be the type of person who would be more likely to go towards an assassination. If you had somebody who was just angry, but was not depressed and had lots of social connections around, we don't know yet. It's too early to know about the social life of the Charlie Kirk shooter. But it's interesting to explore the intersection of these three things, because they do seem to be factors in both political violence and mass violence. And so understanding where people land on that Venn diagram. I like to diagram things. I like to see it as a picture, so that's helpful for me to understand that, and that will kind of be our guide as we as we start this project. So I definitely think that the difference is perhaps less depression, perhaps more anger, more the anger to motivate them to do something that requires significantly more planning, potentially more risk, because in both of these attempts, there was security involved against a high-profile target. So a higher level of anger could potentially motivate them to move in that direction versus more towards the mass violence route. So that's what I see right off the surface. Don't want to comment too much about this because it's still very early. We're like 2 weeks into starting to think and put some thought leadership into this. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, well, I just, I guess why. So that's why you think, despite some of the differences we can see, like for instance, a lot of these assassins do appear to have like a political motivation, at least in part to what they're doing. The Kirk assassin told his roommate that in the texts that have been released that he wanted to kill Kirk because he thought it was hateful. But of course, that's the same thing for you look at Mangione, the United Healthcare CEO. That seemed to have been he talked in his manifesto, his writings about the healthcare system and intentionally choosing a CEO as a political target, a symbolic target. The Minnesota assassin was in an interview with The Blaze talked about how he's motivated by his conspiratorial thinking around the COVID-19 vaccine, and that he was going to make. Now, again, you have to be cautious about taking these killers, their words at full face value, of course, because the Minnesota assassin was talking about how he was going to do citizen arrests is what he intended, but he went around and murdered 2 people and then tried to murder 3 more at another location and had a whole list of people. Yeah. So not everything they say is necessarily going to be the truth, of course, but there appear the Pelosi, the guy who broke into Pelosi's house and assaulted her husband, I believe was also, his words was he was motivated by, conspiratorial view of Pelosi's. That's not, you don't see that as much with your typical mass shooter or school shooter. Although there's complicating things for all the Charlie Kirk assassin also seemed to have the internet nihilism there. He was he wrote on the bullets, where Mangione's writing was more about political, healthcare, insurance related messages, deny, defend. What he wrote on his ammunition was different than the Kirk shooter who wrote, according to his text, were just, and reading the words on them, they were internet memes, gaming memes and other like edgelord stuff. I don't know. I guess it's just there. How do you take that same approach that you've tailored for these attacks that are don't appear to be as politically motivated and apply them in areas where that seems to at least be a significant part of the driver?
Yeah, and I would say, do you think it would be fair to say that perpetrators of mass violence are often motivated by social causes or social issues, which may, for instance, thinking about the Buffalo, New York shooter, he was very concerned about racial issues. I think he specifically named some racial, political hot button topics in his manifesto.
He had racist motivations, certainly. Although like a lot of these guys too, I will say, like just like the Kirk shooter, he had him saying that he targeted Kirk because he thought Kirk was hateful is a pretty clear political motivation, but also writing memes from Helldivers 2 or, if you read this, you're gay, LMAO on ammunition suggests there's some incoherence there. Just like the Buffalo shooter who was doing, a very racist act, overtly racist act, but obviously. But then also, if you read his manifesto, like a lot of manifestos, it's sort of all over the place. He talks about like eco terror. He has sympathy for eco terrorists, and it's not like you're getting somebody who's a traditional party line voter. And it's not usually like that. Even with these assassins, it's not usually. Charlie Kirk's assassin doesn't seem to have been politically engaged beyond just hating Charlie Kirk. So I don't know. It's I guess
so that's something
things.
We're very comfortable with. So we rarely see people with a very coherent, well articulated kind of set of beliefs or principles. It is always over the map, all over the map. Lots of little things sprinkled in, anti-capitalist in one moment, but then, like complaining that they're not a billionaire the next moment. So obviously there's an ideological inconsistency there. So yeah, we're very comfortable with that. Because we're always doing these deep dives into, internet subcultures. There is no, there's not a lot of bright lines. It's not a lot of white and black. The same jokes made by one side will be made by the other side. A good example is one of his cartridges said it was like a homophobic slur. And you would think that would be confined to one side, but it's not. Both sides will make the same exact slur.
Yeah, if you read this, you're gay.
Yeah. So that could be something a homophobic person could say, or it could be something said by somebody who's very comfortable with that lifestyle.
Yeah,
and we see this all.
Was he was dating a trans person?
Yeah,
is my understanding of it. But yeah, so you would be like, why would somebody who's clearly one of the reasons he perhaps didn't like Charlie Kirk was Kirk's views on trans people, and but at the same time, wrote that message on the bullet. It just feels like a more edgelord sort of behavior, internet edgelord, internet poison kind of BS.
Right. And Peter Langford, who's one of the leading subject matter experts on mass violence, he says something that's always resonated with me, that the cause of a perpetrator of violence, it could be personal, it could be perceived, or it could be fictional. So we think about that again. So we're looking at this Venn diagram of depression, anger, and social isolation. That depression or that anger, it could be personal, it could be vicarious, or it could be perceived, on somebody else's benefit. I think Peter Langford says vicarious, or it could be fictional entirely. So we don't necessarily need to. It's less important to us whether their arguments make sense, but whether it's something they believe in. So somebody could be very angry about things that don't fit neatly within red or blue, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. And we do find, especially within the younger generation, especially with people online, it's very much an a la carte philosophy for both politics, religion, ethics. It's wrong for billionaires to steal, but it's okay for me to steal. So it's very much an a la carte picking and choosing of different things.
Chaos versus not chaos to it.
Yeah, so we're very comfortable with that. Right. We see that all the time, and we look past that. What's really going on? Like, you're angry. It doesn't really matter what you're angry about, but how can you? What are you going to do with that anger, and how can we channel that into a healthy direction? And that's going to be true whether whether the person is thinking about committing an assassination or committing an act of violence. There's some underlying motivation, and if we can understand that and understand the alternative, what's the antidote? What would demotivate them, and what are they really looking for? Philosophically, all vices are the extremes of virtues, right? So underneath this desire to do something horrible is potentially a suppressed desire to do something good, and if we can elicit that and lead them in that direction, that's where we think about redemptive care. Redeeming this anger and helping people channel it in healthy directions that are good for themselves and good for the people around them is really our goal. And I think that'll be equally attainable whether the person is thinking about hurting themselves, hurting others, or hurting a very specific person in a very public way.
That makes sense. It does make sense. And so your hope now is to get these studies funded and find academic partners to work with you on that. I guess you already have some.
Yeah, some great people from the University of South Carolina that we're working with, but they're in the same boat as we are. We all need the funding to push this forward. It's not easy to do in a vacuum.
And then you want to, from what you find in those studies, you want to develop better understanding of how to off-ramp people both from mass violence and from targeted, assassination attacks.
Exactly. We're going to keep doing the outreach campaigns. Our focus is still very much on preventing mass violence, but I would like to see us expand and also, do the same thing to prevent political violence as well.
And so if people want to, follow the work that you guys are doing or help, make this a reality, where can they do that? How can they help?
Absolutely. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit. All donations to us are tax deductible. You can give to our work at letstalktothem.org. And you can say, if you specifically are interested in funding research into this topic of assassinations, by all means, mention that in your donation. And then if you have an interest in volunteering with us, if you have connections that you think would be helpful, we also have on letstalktothem.org a volunteer portal as well. So by all means, reach out and talk to us. And consider supporting this work because our focus is mass violence, but we also want to have the resources to expand and prevent these types of assassinations from happening again.
Great. And again, you are a registered 501c3 charity now, so that comes with specific oversight like 990 reports and the ability for donors to deduct their donations in certain circumstances from their taxes as well. So, this is not, a GoFundMe operation. You guys are a formal registered charity now with the ability for donors to also scrutinize your books every year when the 990 comes out. So important to note that as well. But yeah, so we really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise and your experience in this attempt to reduce these sorts of attacks and give us some potential solutions because I find that to be valuable in the time when we're talking a lot about the problem, understandably so. But I think it's good to have somebody on who's working on potential solutions for these terrible situations. So I appreciate you doing that. And I appreciate you coming on and we'll have to have you back on again to give us another update down the line on, how these efforts are going and update us on all of that. So I look forward to having you back on.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. That's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.